Marcus Chen had seen enough death for 10 lifetimes. Yet here he stood in the most beautiful palace he'd ever imagined, watching alien nobles dance beneath crystalline chandeliers that sang with their own light. The scars on his face caught the rainbow gleams, creating a map of violence across skin that had once been smooth. His left eye was gone, replaced by a simple black patch that he wore like a badge of honor. His right arm ended at the wrist, the prosthetic hand hidden beneath formal gloves that couldn't quite hide the mechanical joints. The Zalarian court was unlike anything from Earth's history. Beings of impossible beauty glided across floors made from what looked like captured starlight. Some had wings that shimmered like oil on water. Others had skin that changed color with their emotions. And a few seemed to be made entirely of living crystal. They wore clothes that defied physics, flowing fabrics that moved independently of gravity, and jewelry that floated around their bodies like miniature solar systems. Marcus felt like a broken toy among gods. But he'd earned his place here through blood and sacrifice. 3 years ago, he'd been just another mercenary scraping by on the Outer Rim colonies, taking whatever jobs would pay enough to keep his ship running and his belly full. Now he was the personal bodyguard to Queen Lirali of the Zalarian Empire, the most powerful being in this arm of the galaxy. The queen herself was a vision that made even hardened soldiers weep. Her skin was the pale blue of winter ice, marked with silver patterns that moved across her flesh like living tattoos. Her hair was white as fresh snow but seemed to contain actual stars, tiny points of light that twinkled as she moved. Her eyes were the deep purple of nebulae, holding depths that suggested she'd seen the birth and death of worlds. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, elegant and regal in a way that made every other being in the room seem crude by comparison. Marcus remembered the first time he'd seen her, chained in the cargo hold of a slaver ship that he'd been hired to raid. The pirates had thought they'd captured the greatest prize in the galaxy, not knowing that Queen Lirali had allowed herself to be taken to infiltrate their organization and learn the extent of their operation. She'd been playing a long game while Marcus and his crew had stumbled into the middle of it. The fighting had been brutal. The slavers had more ships, better weapons, and the advantage of knowing their own territory. Marcus's crew had been outnumbered 20-1, but they'd taken the job because the pay was worth dying for. He'd lost his eye to a plasma burn when their ship's hull was breached, and his hand had been crushed when debris pinned him against a bulkhead. But somehow, through luck or stubbornness, or both, they'd won. When he'd found the queen in that cargo hold, he'd expected to find another broken victim. Instead, he'd found someone who looked at him with curiosity rather than fear. Someone who seemed more concerned about his wounds than her own situation. She'd spoken to him in perfect standard, her voice like music played on crystal chimes. "You're hurt," she'd said, as if stating the obvious wasn't already clear from the blood running down his face. "I've been worse," he'd lied, trying not to let her see how much pain he was in. She'd reached out with one elegant hand and touched his wounded face, and suddenly the agony had faded to a dull ache. "You saved me," she'd said simply, "though I suspect you didn't know who I was." "Just another job," he'd replied, though something about her made him want to be honest. "Didn't matter who you were. Nobody deserves to be in chains." She'd smiled then, an expression so radiant that it had made his heart skip. Such a human thing to say. Your species is either the most noble or most foolish in the galaxy, perhaps both. That conversation had changed everything. When the Queen had offered him a position as her personal guard, his crew had thought he was crazy to accept. Personal guards to alien royalty didn't usually live long, and humans weren't exactly known for their diplomatic skills. But something about her had called to him. A recognition that he couldn't explain even to himself. Now, 3 years later, he understood what she'd meant about humans being noble and foolish. Every other species in the galaxy thought in terms of logic, advantage, and survival. They made alliances based on benefit and betrayed each other when it served their interests. Humans were different. They would die for strangers, sacrifice themselves for ideas, and stand against impossible odds because it was the right thing to do. The Zalarian nobles around him tonight were beautiful and sophisticated. But Marcus had learned to read the subtle signs of their politics. The way Lord Kithara's skin shifted from green to orange whenever he looked at the Queen suggested jealousy mixed with desire. Lady Vorthak's crystalline form grew darker when certain topics came up, indicating anger or resentment. The young Prince Alzreth kept his wings folded tight against his body, a sign of nervousness or fear. There were undercurrents here tonight that made Marcus's soldier instincts twitch. Too many private conversations that stopped when he approached. Too many glances in the Queen's direction that held calculation rather than admiration. The Queen had warned him that not everyone in her court was loyal, that there were those who saw her policies of peace and cooperation as weakness. Queen Lirelei had been trying to build an alliance of species that included humans, despite the fact that most of the galaxy saw Earth's children as violent primitives. She believed that humanity's unique perspective could help solve problems that had plagued civilized space for millennia. The fact that humans could feel empathy for their enemies, could sacrifice themselves for abstract concepts like justice and freedom, made them valuable allies in her vision of a better universe. Not everyone agreed with her assessment. The hegemony faction, led by Lord Cathara, believed that might made right and that the strong should rule over the weak. They saw humans as useful soldiers at best, dangerous rebels at worst. The old guard wanted to return to the traditional ways of conquest and domination that had kept the Zalarian Empire stable for 1,000 years. Marcus touched the communication device in his ear, a piece of Zalarian technology that was worth more than his old ship. The Queen's voice came through clearly despite the music and conversation around them. "Marcus," she said without moving her lips, the words transmitted directly to his device. "Do you see the servants near the eastern corridor?" He turned his gaze casually toward the area she'd mentioned. 3 Zalarian servants in the traditional white robes were moving through the crowd, carrying trays of the luminescent drinks that the nobles favored. They looked perfectly normal, except for one detail that would have escaped anyone who hadn't spent years studying alien body language. "Their movement patterns are wrong," he subvocalized back, knowing she would hear him through her own device. "Too coordinated. Military training. I concur. Also, Lord Cathara has dismissed his personal guards for the evening. Most unusual." Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that came before combat. His prosthetic hand flexed automatically, the synthetic muscles responding to his nervous system, just like biological ones. The Queen was in danger, and he was the only thing standing between her and whatever was coming. "Your Majesty," he said through the comm, "perhaps it would be wise to retire early this evening and show weakness to my enemies?" "I think not, my dear Marcus. Besides, if they mean to move against me, better to face them here where I can control the battlefield." That was so typical of her. Queen Lirelei never backed down from a fight, even when wisdom suggested retreat. It was one of the things that had made her people love her and her enemies fear her. It was also one of the things that kept Marcus awake at night, knowing that his job was to protect someone who would gladly throw herself into danger for the sake of principle. The dance music swelled, and the Queen moved gracefully among her guests, accepting their compliments and engaging in the delicate verbal sparring that passed for conversation among the nobility. She was magnificent to watch, every gesture calculated for maximum effect, every word chosen to advance her agenda or gather information. She could make a potential enemy feel valued while simultaneously warning them against betrayal, all with a smile that never seemed forced. Marcus stayed close, but not too close. He'd learned that hovering obviously made the nobles nervous and gave the impression that the Queen didn't trust her own people. Instead, he positioned himself where he could see the entire room and react quickly to any threat. His remaining eye swept constantly across the crowd, cataloging faces, watching for weapons, noting who was where and what they were doing. The 3 false servants had split up, taking positions that would allow them to surround the Queen if they moved simultaneously. Professional work, Marcus thought grimly. Whoever was behind this had trained their people well, but they'd made one mistake. They were thinking like Zalarians, expecting their target to be alone and vulnerable like traditional royalty. They hadn't accounted for the scarred human who had learned warfare in the brutal conflicts of the Outer Rim, who had survived battles that would have broken the spirits of their sophisticated soldiers. Marcus had fought against species that made war their religion, had stood against odds that should have killed him a dozen times over. 3 assassins, no matter how well trained, were just another problem to solve. The Queen caught his eye across the room and gave him the slightest nod, She'd seen them too and was ready for whatever was coming. Her own abilities were far from helpless. Zalarian royalty didn't survive for centuries without learning to defend themselves. But she also knew that Marcus brought something to the fight that no other guard could: the human willingness to die for someone else without counting the cost. As the evening progressed, more guests arrived, including several members of the hegemony faction that Marcus recognized from intelligence briefings. Lord Kithara's supporters were gathering, their presence filling the room with an undercurrent of tension that made the very air seem thicker. The Queen continued to smile and charm her guests, but Marcus could see the way her silver markings had begun to pulse slightly faster, indicating elevated stress levels. "It's almost time," she whispered through the comm. "Whatever they're planning, it will be soon." Marcus checked his weapons discreetly. The plasma pistol hidden in his formal jacket was fully charged, and the monomolecular blade in his boot could cut through almost anything short of battleship armor. His prosthetic hand contained several surprises that most people didn't know about, including a shield generator and a small but powerful energy weapon. More importantly, he had something that couldn't be seen or measured: 3 years of absolute loyalty to the woman who had given him purpose after a lifetime of aimless violence. The Queen had shown him that his scars could be signs of honor rather than failure, that his willingness to fight could protect something beautiful instead of just destroying his enemies. The music changed, becoming slower and more ceremonial. This was the traditional time for important announcements, when the Queen would address her court and share news or proclamations. It was also the perfect time for an assassination attempt, when all attention would be focused on one person standing in an exposed position. Queen Lirelei moved to the center of the Great Hall, her presence immediately drawing every eye in the room. She was luminous in the crystalline light, beautiful and powerful and utterly vulnerable to anyone willing to commit murder in front of hundreds of witnesses. Marcus positioned himself where he could move quickly, his muscles tensed and ready. The 3 false servants had begun to drift closer, their trays providing perfect cover for concealed weapons. Lord Kithara and his supporters formed a loose circle around the area, ready to block any escape routes. This was it. After 3 years of peace and prosperity, the enemies of progress were ready to make their move. They thought they could eliminate the Queen and return to the old ways of fear and oppression. They thought that killing one idealistic ruler would end the dream of a better galaxy. They were about to learn why humans had a reputation for being the most dangerous species in known space, and why the man with scars on his face and fire in his heart had earned the right to stand beside a queen. The journey to this moment had been written in blood and sacrifice across a dozen worlds. Marcus remembered each scar on his body like a chapter in a book of violence. The burn on his shoulder from the plasma rifle on Kepler Prime, where he'd held a choke point alone for 6 hours against overwhelming odds. The twisted metal fragment still embedded near his spine from the asteroid mining station, where corporate security had tried to murder a whistleblower and her family. The synthetic skin grafts covering his back where he'd shielded a group of refugee children from an incendiary bomb. Each mark told a story of choices made in impossible circumstances, of moments when he could have walked away but chose to stand and fight instead. His old crew used to joke that Marcus collected scars like other people collected medals, but they'd never understood that each one represented someone he'd saved or something he'd protected. The Queen understood, though. She'd traced those scars with her fingers during the long nights when she'd healed the worst of his injuries, her touch somehow reaching deeper than skin and bone to mend parts of his soul that he'd thought were permanently broken. She'd never asked for the stories behind each mark, but somehow she'd known exactly what they meant. That understanding had forged a bond between them that went beyond duty or employment. She was the first person who had ever looked at his damaged body and seen strength instead of weakness, honor instead of failure. In return, he'd given her something that couldn't be bought or commanded: absolute loyalty freely given. The crowd around them seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. Conversations grew quieter, and the constant movement of the nobles began to slow as they turned their attention toward the center of the room. The Queen stood perfectly still, waiting for complete silence before she spoke. Marcus used the moment to make final preparations. He activated the enhanced vision mode in his eye patch, allowing him to see heat signatures and energy readings that would reveal concealed weapons. The 3 false servants immediately lit up like beacons, their bodies registering multiple energy sources that had nothing to do with serving drinks. More concerning was what he saw when he scanned Lord Kithara and his supporters. Several of them showed the telltale signs of combat enhancement drugs, their metabolisms running hot and fast in ways that suggested they were prepared for immediate violence. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a coordinated coup designed to eliminate the Queen and seize control of the Empire in one brutal stroke. "My lords and ladies," the Queen began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast hall, despite its conversational tone. "Tonight we celebrate not just our prosperity, but our vision of a future where strength serves wisdom rather than the other way around." The words were a direct challenge to the hegemony faction, and Marcus saw the way Lord Kithara's skin shifted to a deeper orange in response. Several of his supporters made subtle hand gestures that Marcus recognized as military signals. They were coordinating their attack for maximum effect. "For too long," the Queen continued, "our people have believed that might alone could secure our place in the galaxy. We have conquered worlds and enslaved populations, telling ourselves that strength gave us the right to rule over others. But true strength comes from protecting the weak, not exploiting them." A murmur ran through the crowd, some voices supportive, others clearly opposed. The division in the court had never been more obvious, with nobles arranging themselves into distinct groups based on their political loyalties. Marcus noted that the Queen's supporters were outnumbered roughly 3-1, a sobering reminder of how precarious their position really was. "Tonight," Queen Lirelei said, her silver markings beginning to pulse with brighter light, "I want to tell you about true courage. Not the courage of conquest, but the courage of sacrifice. Not the courage of the strong who prey upon the weak, but the courage of those who stand between evil and innocence, knowing that they may not survive." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized she was talking about him. About the moment when their paths had first crossed. She was making their relationship public, declaring to the entire court that she valued the loyalty of a scarred human mercenary above the approval of her own nobles. It was a political masterstroke and a declaration of war rolled into one. By elevating him publicly, she was forcing her enemies to act immediately or risk losing their chance forever. No one could claim that her reforms were a temporary madness if she was willing to stake her throne on the worth of an alien bodyguard. Lord Kithara stepped forward, his formal robes shimmering with suppressed energy fields. "My Queen," he said, his voice carrying the subtle harmonics that indicated controlled fury. "Surely you do not mean to suggest that the Empire's future should be guided by the opinions of lesser species?" The insult was carefully calculated, delivered with just enough diplomatic language to avoid being treasonous while making his position perfectly clear. He was challenging her judgment, her policies, and her right to rule all in one elegant sentence. Marcus felt his muscles tense as the three false servants began to move, their coordinated approach becoming more obvious as they closed the distance to their target. They would strike during the confrontation between the Queen and Lord Kithara, using the political theater as cover for their attack. "Lord Kithara," the Queen replied with a smile that could have frozen starlight, "I mean to suggest that wisdom can come from unexpected sources. The species you call lesser have something that our people have forgotten, the ability to value principles above personal gain." "Principles," Kithara spat, his diplomatic mask finally slipping, "are luxuries that only the strong can afford. The galaxy is full of predators, my Queen. If we show weakness, we will be devoured. And yet," she said, gesturing toward Marcus without looking away from her challenger, "the humans have shown us that it is possible to be both strong and compassionate. They fight not for conquest, but for protection. They die not for glory, but for justice." The first assassin was now within striking distance, his hand moving toward something concealed beneath his serving tray. Marcus calculated angles and distances, preparing to move the moment the threat became active. Around the room, Lord Kithara's supporters were shifting position, ready to block any escape routes or reinforcements. This was it. 3 years of building toward this moment, 3 years of politics and diplomacy and careful maneuvering, all coming down to the next few seconds. The future of the Zellarian Empire, and possibly the entire Galactic Alliance, would be decided by whether one scarred human could move fast enough to save the life of an alien queen. Marcus touched the grip of his concealed weapon and prepared to remind everyone present why humanity had earned their place among the stars through violence and sacrifice. The formal clothes and civilized surroundings couldn't change what he really was. A soldier who had learned to kill in the service of something greater than himself. The assassin's hand closed around his weapon, and time seemed to slow as Marcus prepared to step between his queen and death one more time. The plasma charge erupted from beneath the servant's tray in a burst of superheated energy that would have vaporized the queen's head if Marcus hadn't already been moving. He threw himself across the space between them, his prosthetic hand extending to activate its built-in shield generator. The barrier of crackling energy caught the plasma bolt and deflected it into the crystalline ceiling, where it shattered one of the singing chandeliers in a shower of musical fragments. Marcus hit the queen with enough force to knock her to the ground, his body covering hers as the second and third assassins opened fire. Plasma bolts seared the air above them, close enough that he could feel the heat through his formal jacket. Around the great hall, screams erupted as the assembled nobles suddenly realized that their elegant evening had become a battlefield. "Stay down!" Marcus growled to the queen as he rolled to put himself between her and the attackers. His remaining eye took in the tactical situation in a single glance. 3 assassins forming a rough triangle around their position, Lord Kithara and his supporters moving to block the exits, and chaos spreading through the crowd as panicked nobles trampled each other in their rush to escape. The first assassin was already reaching for a second weapon. But Marcus had spent 3 years studying Zalarian physiology and knew their weak points. His plasma pistol cleared its holster in one smooth motion, and his shot took the alien center mass, right where their primary heart was located. The assassin dropped like a cut marionette, his weapon scattering across the starlight floor. The second attacker tried to use a fleeing noble as cover, but Marcus had learned urban combat in the slums of New Shanghai, where innocent bystanders were part of every equation. He put 2 shots into the wall above the assassin's head, and the ricochets caught him from an unexpected angle. Zalarian reflexes were faster than human ones, but Marcus had the advantage of experience with real warfare rather than formal dueling. The third assassin had taken cover behind one of the floating decorative crystals and was laying down suppressing fire to keep Marcus pinned. Each blast that hit near their position sent chunks of shattered floor spinning through the air like shrapnel. The queen's silver markings were now pulsing with brilliant light as her own defensive abilities activated, creating a protective field around them both. "Can you maintain that barrier?" Marcus asked as he reloaded his weapon. "For a few minutes," she replied, her voice strained with the effort. "But my people's abilities were never designed for prolonged combat." Marcus nodded and began planning his next move. The third assassin had good cover in the high ground, but he'd made the mistake of assuming that his target would stay pinned down. Humans had a reputation for unpredictable tactics because they were willing to take risks that other species considered suicidal. "When I move, drop the barrier and get behind the throne," Marcus said. "Lord Kithara's people are moving to surround us, and we need to limit the angles they can attack from." Before she could protest, Marcus was moving. He sprinted directly toward the third assassin's position, using the panicking crowd as cover while plasma bolts seared past his head. The alien's shots were accurate, but he was aiming for where Marcus had been rather than where he was going. Human unpredictability in action. Marcus reached the crystal formation and used his prosthetic hand to punch through what looked like solid rock. The synthetic muscles could generate far more force than biological ones, and the element of surprise worked in his favor. His hand closed around the assassin's throat before the alien could bring his weapon to bear. "Nothing personal," Marcus said as his artificial fingers applied pressure to the exact points that would render a Zalarian unconscious without killing them. The queen preferred her enemies captured rather than eliminated when possible, and he'd learned to accommodate her merciful nature even in the middle of combat. With the immediate threat eliminated, Marcus turned his attention to the larger problem. Lord Kithara's supporters had used the chaos to position themselves strategically around the hall. They weren't trying to escape. They were preparing for the next phase of their coup attempt. "Surrender the pretender queen," Lord Kithara called out, his voice amplified by some kind of vocal enhancement technology. "Her policies of weakness have made us vulnerable to our enemies. The Empire requires strong leadership to survive the coming storm. Marcus helped Queen Lirelei to her feet, noting that her protective field was already starting to flicker. Extended use of their natural abilities exhausted the Zalarians quickly, which was why they'd traditionally relied on technology and military strength rather than personal power. "The only storm I see," the Queen replied, her voice carrying clearly despite the absence of artificial amplification, "is the one created by those who mistake cruelty for strength." Around the hall, the nobles who hadn't fled were choosing sides. Some moved to join Lord Kithara's group, while others began gravitating toward the Queen's position. Marcus counted roughly 30 hostiles against maybe a dozen allies. Not good odds even under the best circumstances. What worried him more was that none of Lord Kithara's people seemed concerned about the palace guard. Either they'd been bribed or eliminated, which meant that help wasn't coming. This was a carefully planned operation designed to settle the Empire's political future in a single bloody night. "You have one chance to end this peacefully," Marcus called out to the rebels. "Lay down your weapons and accept the Queen's justice. She's shown mercy to her enemies before." Lord Kithara's laugh was like the sound of breaking crystal. "Mercy? From a human? Your species is known for many things, but mercy is not one of them." Marcus felt a cold smile spread across his scarred face. "You're right. Humans aren't known for mercy. We're known for killing anyone who threatens the people we care about." He activated his prosthetic hand's secondary function, and a monomolecular blade extended from his wrist. The weapon was invisible to the naked eye, a line of disrupted space that could cut through almost any known material. More importantly, it was completely silent and gave no warning before it struck. The first rebel to approach their position never saw what killed him. One moment he was advancing with his weapon raised, the next moment his plasma rifle was falling to pieces as the invisible blade passed through it. The follow-up strike caught him across the chest, dropping him instantly. The sight of their companion falling without any apparent cause sent a ripple of unease through Lord Kithara's forces. Zalarians were creatures of logic and predictability. They didn't handle well the idea that death could come without warning or explanation. Marcus pressed his advantage, moving among them like a ghost made of violence. His remaining eye tracked multiple targets while his enhanced reflexes let him dodge return fire that should have been impossible to avoid. The formal training of the palace guard was no match for lessons learned in the chaos of real war. But there were too many of them, and Marcus was only one man with one eye and one hand. For every rebel he put down, two more seemed to take their place. Slowly but inevitably, they were being driven back toward the throne, their defensive position shrinking with each passing moment. "Marcus," the Queen said quietly, "you should know that Lord Kithara has political support from outside the Empire. This isn't just about internal politics." "Meaning?" Marcus asked, as he reloaded his plasma pistol for the third time. "Meaning that even if we survive tonight, there will be others. The hegemony has allies among the Kronar Syndicate and the Vorthan Collective. They see our alliance with humanity as a threat to their own expansion plans." Marcus processed this information while putting down two more attackers. A galactic conspiracy made the situation both better and worse. Better because it meant the Queen's reforms were working well enough to threaten the old power structures. Worse because it meant that tonight was just the beginning of a much larger conflict. "Well," he said, ejecting another spent power cell, "at least we know we're fighting for something worth dying for." Queen Lirelei's silver markings flared brighter as she began drawing on deeper reserves of power. "I have one ability that might turn the tide, but it will leave me completely defenseless for several minutes." "What kind of ability?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. The Zalarian royal family had abilities that went far beyond personal protection, powers that they used only in the most desperate circumstances. "I can disrupt the neural patterns of every non-Zalarian in the room," she said. "It will render them unconscious but won't cause permanent damage. However, it affects humans as well as the rebels." Marcus understood immediately. She could end the fight in seconds, but it would leave her alone with Lord Kithara and his supporters, while Marcus was unconscious and unable to protect her. It was the kind of impossible choice that defined real warfare. Save everyone by sacrificing yourself, or fight to the end and risk losing everything. "Do it," Marcus said without hesitation. But you'll be helpless, she protested. I've been helpless before. Besides, you're forgetting something important. What? Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face into something that would have given nightmares to anyone who saw it. I'm not the only human in this room anymore. As if summoned by his words, the great hall's main doors exploded inward. Through the smoke and debris came a sight that made Lord Kithara's supporters stop dead in their tracks. 50 humans in full combat armor. Their weapons already tracking targets with mechanical precision. At their head was Sarah Chen, Marcus's sister, and the commander of the human military advisory team that the Queen had invited to help modernize the Zalarian defense forces. Her armor bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, and her rifle was already spitting coherent energy at the rebels who'd thought they could murder their way to power. Sorry we're late. Brother, she called out, as her team spread through the room with professional efficiency. Traffic was murder. The rebels had planned for many contingencies, but they hadn't planned for the possibility that the Queen's human allies might arrive in the middle of their coup attempt. Within seconds, the tactical situation had completely reversed. Now it was Lord Kithara's people who were outnumbered and outgunned. Caught between the Queen's loyal nobles and a squad of human soldiers who had trained specifically for this kind of urban warfare. Surrender now, Sarah called out, her voice amplified by her suit's external speakers. And you'll live to stand trial. Keep fighting, and we'll demonstrate why humans have never lost a defensive battle. Lord Kithara looked around at his demoralized supporters, many of whom were already throwing down their weapons. The carefully planned coup was disintegrating before his eyes, undone by the same human unpredictability that had allowed Marcus to survive as long as he had. This isn't over, he snarled as he raised his hands in surrender. The galaxy will never accept human influence in Zalarian affairs. You've won a battle, not the war. Marcus walked over to where Lord Kithara stood, his plasma pistol trained on the defeated rebel leader. Up close, he could see the fear in the alien's color-shifting skin, the way his natural camouflage patterns betrayed his true emotional state, despite his defiant words. You're right, Marcus said quietly. This is just one battle. But you made one mistake tonight that's going to cost you everything. And what was that? Lord Kithara asked, with as much dignity as he could muster. Marcus smiled again, the expression made even more terrifying by the scars that twisted across his face. You threatened someone that a human cares about, and there's nothing in this galaxy more dangerous than a human who's fighting to protect something he loves. The trials that followed the attempted coup lasted for 3 weeks, with nobles from across the Zalarian Empire arriving to witness the proceedings. Marcus had expected the usual political theater. But Queen Lirale had surprised everyone by conducting the trials according to human legal principles, rather than traditional Zalarian justice. The accused were allowed to defend themselves, evidence was presented publicly, and even Lord Kithara was given the chance to explain his actions. Marcus watched from his position beside the throne as former rebels testified about their motivations. Many claimed they'd acted out of genuine fear for the Empire's future, convinced that the Queen's reforms would lead to weakness and eventual conquest by their enemies. Others admitted to being motivated by personal ambition or the promise of power in a new regime. What disturbed Marcus most was learning the full scope of the conspiracy. Lord Kithara hadn't been lying about outside support. Intelligence gathered from the captured rebels revealed that several major galactic powers had been funding the coup attempt. The Kronar Syndicate, the Vorthan Collective, and even the isolationist Nexus Federation had all contributed resources to destabilize the Zalarian Empire. They're afraid, Queen Lirale explained during one of their private planning sessions. For centuries, the balance of power in this part of the galaxy has remained stable because no one wanted to risk the kind of war that would devastate everything. But our alliance with humanity has introduced a new element that they can't control or predict. Marcus nodded, understanding the implications. Human military doctrine was based on adaptability and innovation, rather than overwhelming force or traditional tactics. More importantly, human willingness to sacrifice themselves for abstract principles made them impossible to intimidate or bribe effectively. So what happens now? He asked. Now we prove that their fears are justified. the Queen said with a smile that reminded Marcus why he'd fallen in love with her courage. Not because we want to conquer anyone, but because we're going to build something better than anything the galaxy has seen before. The sentences handed down by the court were surprisingly lenient by Zalarian standards. Instead of execution or permanent exile, most of the conspirators were given the chance to serve the Empire in roles that would let them contribute positively to its future. Even Lord Cathara was offered a position in the colonial administration, though he would be supervised and his movements restricted. Marcus had expected the defeated rebels to refuse such mercy, but most of them accepted their sentences with what seemed like genuine relief. Apparently, they'd been expecting traditional Zalarian justice, which would have involved public execution for treason. The Queen's human-influenced approach to forgiveness had caught them completely off guard. "You realize this makes you look weak to the old guard nobles," Marcus pointed out. "Perhaps," the Queen agreed. "But it also demonstrates that our new policies produce better results than the old ways. These people will remember that I spared their lives when I could have taken them. Their loyalty going forward will be worth more than any temporary satisfaction from executing them." Marcus wasn't entirely convinced, but he'd learned to trust the Queen's political instincts. She understood her own people in ways that he never could, and her reforms had already begun showing positive results throughout the Empire. The real surprise came 3 days after the trials ended, when the Queen called him to the throne room for what she described as a matter of imperial importance. Marcus arrived expecting another political crisis or security briefing, but instead found the Great Hall filled with representatives from dozens of different species. There were humans in their practical military uniforms, Zalarians in their flowing ceremonial robes, crystalline Vorthans who sparkled like living jewels, and even a delegation of the enigmatic Transcendents whose bodies seemed to be made of pure energy. Marcus had never seen so many different species gathered peacefully in one place. "Marcus Chen," the Queen announced as he approached the throne, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. 3 years ago, you saved my life without knowing who I was or what I represented. Since then, you have served with distinction, protecting not just my person, but the ideals of justice and compassion that I believe can unite the galaxy. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a formal recognition that would be broadcast throughout known space. Every major government and news service in the galaxy would be watching. "Your scars," the Queen continued, rising from her throne to stand before him, "tell the story of a life spent protecting others. Each mark represents a choice to stand between evil and innocence, to sacrifice yourself for the sake of strangers. These are not signs of failure or weakness, but badges of the highest honor." She gestured to a floating platform that materialized beside her, bearing an object that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It was a collar of some kind. But unlike any jewelry he'd ever seen, the metal seemed to contain actual starlight, with patterns that shifted and flowed like living galaxies. Embedded within it were gems that pulsed with their own inner fire, each one a different color that somehow harmonized with the others. "This is the nexus of worlds," the Queen explained, "created by the combined efforts of every species represented here today. It has taken us 3 years to forge, using technologies and materials from across the galaxy. It has never been given to anyone before, because no one has ever been worthy of what it represents." Marcus stared at the artifact, unable to process what he was seeing. The amount of cooperation required to create something like this was staggering. Species that had been enemies for millennia would have had to work together, sharing their most advanced technologies and precious resources. "What does it do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It makes you our first galactic guardian," the Queen replied. "A position that exists outside normal political structures, answerable only to the collective conscience of civilized space. You would have the authority to act anywhere in the galaxy when innocent lives are threatened, with the full support of every government represented here." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. They were offering him the authority to intervene in conflicts anywhere in known space, backed by the combined military might of dozens of different civilizations. It was power beyond anything he'd ever imagined, the kind of responsibility that could reshape the galaxy itself. "Why me?" he asked. Because, said a new voice, and Marcus turned to see one of the Transcendents approaching. You have already demonstrated that you can wield power responsibly. You have had opportunities to abuse your position as the Queen's Guard, to seek personal gain or political advantage. Instead, you have remained focused on protecting others. The Transcendent's form shifted as it spoke, patterns of light moving through its energy body in ways that suggested deep emotion. Your species fascinates us, Marcus Chen. Individually, humans are fragile and short-lived compared to most galactic civilizations. But collectively, you possess something that we have lost. The ability to grow beyond your limitations through pure force of will. Marcus looked around the room at all the expectant faces, representing species that had been fighting each other for longer than human civilization had existed. They were asking him to be the symbol of a new era, the bridge between humanity's idealistic vision and the galaxy's practical needs. I'm just a soldier, he protested. I'm not qualified to make decisions that affect entire civilizations. Queen Lirelei stepped closer, her silver markings pulsing with warm light. You're not just a soldier, Marcus. You're a guardian who has already proven that he'll sacrifice everything to protect the innocent. That's exactly what the galaxy needs. She reached out and touched his scarred face with one elegant hand. You asked me once why I chose you as my protector. The answer is simple. Because you never asked for the job. Power given to those who don't want it is the only power that can be trusted. Marcus closed his eyes and felt the weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment. The decision to take a dangerous rescue mission because the pay was good. The choice to fight overwhelming odds because surrender meant letting innocents suffer. The determination to protect a queen whose vision of the future was worth dying for. When he opened his eyes again, his decision was made. I accept, he said simply. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Representatives from species that had never cooperated before came forward one by one to pledge their support for the new galactic guardian. The nexus of worlds was placed around Marcus's neck, its weight somehow both substantial and weightless at the same time. As the artifact settled into place, Marcus felt something change within himself. Information flooded his mind. Star charts, cultural databases, diplomatic protocols, and military capabilities of every civilization present. But more than that, he could sense the collective hope of countless billions of beings who wanted something better than endless cycles of war and exploitation. The scars on his face began to glow with the same light as the Nexus, transforming from marks of damage into symbols of honor. Every wound he'd ever received in service to others became part of a pattern that told the story of human courage and sacrifice. The galaxy is counting on you, Queen Lirelei whispered, as the ceremony concluded, and the representatives began to disperse. Not to be perfect, but to be human. Marcus nodded, understanding what she meant. He wouldn't succeed because he was infallible or all-powerful, but because he would never stop caring about people he'd never met. Never stop fighting for principles that couldn't be measured or quantified. His first assignment came just hours after the ceremony ended. A distress signal from the Outer Rim, where corporate raiders were attacking a refugee convoy carrying survivors from a plague-ravaged world. The kind of situation where traditional diplomacy would take weeks to organize a response, if one came at all. Marcus strapped on his weapons and headed for the docking bay where a ship unlike any he'd ever seen was waiting. The vessel was another collaborative effort, incorporating the best technology from every member species of the new alliance. It was fast enough to cross the galaxy in days rather than months, armed well enough to face any known threat, and equipped with medical facilities that could treat injuries from dozens of different species. As he settled into the pilot's seat, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the cockpit's displays. The man looking back at him was still scarred, still missing an eye and a hand. But somehow those imperfections no longer seemed like limitations. They were reminders of every choice to stand and fight when running would have been easier. Queen Lirelei appeared on the communication screen as the ship cleared the palace's docking bay. Be safe out there, Guardian, she said with a smile that made his heart skip. The galaxy is a dangerous place for idealists. Good thing I'm too stubborn to quit. Marcus replied with a grin that transformed his scarred face into something that radiated hope instead of past pain. As his ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying him toward his first mission as humanity's representative to the stars. Marcus Chen reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He'd started as a broken mercenary, taking whatever jobs would pay the bills. Now he was the most powerful individual in the galaxy, trusted with authority that could reshape the course of civilization itself. The irony wasn't lost on him. His scars, the marks of every failure and sacrifice, had become the very things that made him worthy of such trust. The galaxy didn't need a perfect hero. It needed someone who understood that true strength came from protecting others, not dominating them. Behind him, the Zellarian capital fell away into starlight. But ahead lay a universe full of possibilities. For the first time in human history, one of their kind carried the hopes of an entire galaxy, armed with nothing more than compassion, determination, and the scars that proved he'd earned the right to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. Marcus Chen had found his purpose at last, and the galaxy would never be the same.